Hello and welcome to the Grid Podcast, your podcast about our electricity networks and their role at the heart of our transition towards electrification and net zero. It's me, Brian Moorhead, back hosting again today. Unfortunately, I am on my own because it's kind of holiday season and it was sort of hard to organise. But we thought it was important to check in with a quick update on the big topic that everybody's talking about, connection reform. So for a bit of context, this is the fourth podcast we've done on sort of connection reform specifically, although we've been talking about all the various challenges on different podcasts over the last year or more now. Basically, we'd done the state of play in May, which was a bit of an update on the size of the connection queue back in May, the kind of 700 gigawatt figure that everybody throws around, and the kind of issues facing the kind of industry getting connected to the grid today, which effectively is this huge queue of people trying to connect, lots of oversubscribed capacity and everything else. So basically here we are sort of mid to late August and it's just a quick update. I think the last podcast then we did on connection reform specifically was back around end of May, early June, where we kind of covered the current proposals of what National Grid ESO was proposing to do to kind of fix the issue and rewrite the rulebook on how you get connected to the grid. So where are we today and what has happened since then? Well, we still have this enormous queue. It's still been growing at a lot of gigawatts a month. I'm not even going to get into current figures because they'll be out of date as soon as I say them. But the big one was really National Grid ESO then released their formal consultation and formal proposals on the 25th of July. That consultation then closed on the 6th of August, which is roughly about 8 working days later. Again, very hefty, meaty consultation, about 8 working days. I know a lot of people I've been talking to said they basically struggled to read it in that time as on top of the day job, peak summer holiday season, never mind getting a response in. So ideally we would have recorded this podcast, released it during the consultation period, but there was barely time to get a response in, never mind start recording podcasts. For those technically minded, they were referred to as CMP 434 and CMP 435. One of them was the main consultation on codifying connection reform. The other was around retrospectively applying that reform to people already in the queue to connect. And I think National Grid ESO have had about 60 responses or so, which actually sounds relatively low given the size and kind of weight of the topic. But obviously that kind of very short window in the peak holiday season probably explains that as well. So today I'm going to try and keep this very short and just a real concise high-level overview of what we see as being the key points in those detailed documents. Obviously a lot more detail than we had previously when we last were recording the podcast on the proposals that National Grid had put out. So I think at that stage there was a few pages of very high-level proposals. There's now well over 100 pages worth of detail. I'm going to basically leave a lot of the detail out. A lot of it is very detailed, codifying type stuff. And I'm going to focus on basically 3 kind of big key points that I think the majority of people would have an interest in. So let's just fly into it and try and we'll try and keep this a relatively short podcast then. So the real big one, if you remember back to the previous podcast, the big thing around connection reform was introducing this concept of Gate 2. So effectively, when you apply to National Grid, you get a kind of indicative Gate 1 offer, which in the new proposals, the Gate 1 really doesn't really do much for developers. Or it gives you a very indicative offer without much else, and it gives National Grid a bit of an insight into what might be coming at them. And the focus is really on Gate 2, meeting Gate 2 criteria to get an actual, proper offer that you can rely on. Back in sort of May, June time, the proposal was that it would be based on land rights and being ready to submit planning. And we did say at the time, what does ready to submit planning mean? That would be one of the big topics, that we were saying, look out for further detail on this because this could be very tricky. So in the detailed proposal, what is Gate 2? Well, it's been kind of, in my view, really softened. And that is the headline. It looks very soft, to be honest. And I don't really think it's going to make a big difference in cutting down the queue, which is basically a big issue. That, if these current proposals go through, there's a little bit of this is a bit damp squib for a lot of people in terms of it really isn't going to cut that hard in terms of actually making real change that'll benefit a lot of shovel-ready projects. So yeah, just to get into the detail, it effectively, Gate 2 criteria is having secured land rights, which I'll just refer to my notes, is secured rights to lease or own the land. An exclusivity agreement is not good enough. So effectively, it's the old M3 milestone, for anybody familiar with it, with the exclusivity piece removed. So you need to have an option that's got a minimum 3-year forward-looking period that gives you an option to purchase or lease the land for at least 20 years. And there's also some checks and balances in there on terms of the amount of land you have for that type of technology to make sure that you're not going in with 1 acre for a 5 gigawatt solar farm or whatever. And so what has changed from previous? Well, there isn't really anything in Gate 2 related to planning. So that anything to do with planning criteria is being left for milestones. So effectively, to meet Gate 2, it's all about land rights. Once you get your Gate 2 offer, it will then have these milestones in it. Milestones around, submitting planning, obtaining planning. So that means filtering the queue based on, planning, the status a project has with regards to planning permission. That's not going to happen until sometime after connection reform kicks in. So it means basically from day one, all you're really doing is filtering out stuff that doesn't have land rights, which doesn't feel like it's really going to be a massive change. So that's probably the big one. And we'll touch on actually what has happened sort of since the consultation, because there is some moves. There's obviously a lot of response in industry about this. Quite a lot of people felt the same way, that Gate 2 wasn't going far enough. And there has been actually some movement since, which we'll touch on at the end of this episode, or towards the end of the episode. Sticking with the consultation for now, the second big point that I think is noteworthy is that distribution-connected demand projects are out of scope. So that is basically the vast majority of anybody involved in EV charging, large housing sites, industrial electrification projects across any sort of industry or commercial application. Anybody seeking an import connection to the grid, the vast majority of those are connected to distribution networks, and that's been left totally out of scope of the consultation. Whereas generators connected to distribution networks are in scope. Now, this is a little bit good and bad in terms of, well, you would expect distributed demand to benefit indirectly then by the more onerous criteria coming in on the generation side, particularly around battery storage. But then with Gate 2 having been weakened so much, I think you could probably, a synopsis would be, there's not much in this then for people that, we deal with a lot of people on a daily basis who there is capacity queue issues ahead of them when it comes to large housing sites or EV charging and factories and other applications. Some of those people were holding out for this bigger connection reform piece to be a bit of a solution to that when you see some sort of, maybe speculative battery development or whatever ahead of them in the queue. This might not kick in for quite some time based on the current proposals. So that's the sort of second big point I think is worth noting. And then thirdly, basically none of this, or no one seems to be talking about the issue of distributed connected battery storage being an issue for wider demand projects. So we're constantly seeing it at the minute when we look at a range of industrial projects, whether it's factories looking to set up new electrified processes, EV charging, as I say, housing, being kind of clogged up in the queue behind distribution connected battery storage. And that's not to take a shot at battery storage, by the way, because we obviously work with battery storage developers as well. It's more the fact that the distribution network operators have offered those batteries firm import capacity when the battery storage, people don't really need it. Basically the networks are assuming the battery storage is going to import at peak times during the middle of the day. That is capacity that a housing site or a different type of development could access, but at the minute can't access because it's been allocated to those batteries. So that does seem like a big issue. And at the end of the day, the batteries are there to support the grid and help bring more solutions to the grid. So that does feel like something that needs a bit more attention, because we really are seeing that. Even you did strengthen Gate 2 in National Grid's proposals, that still wouldn't solve this problem. And then you also have the other issue there where some of those batteries at distribution level are being given 2035 connection dates. So their milestones won't kick in for a long, long time. So, you end up with people sitting there, gumming up the queue, sitting idle for a long time. And it's obviously they're not going to be spending a lot of money getting planning and everything else when they're being told it's 2035. So there's definitely something there in terms of process I think needs sorted out. So those are the three, just to recap, those are the three key points I would draw out for just, the general broader section of industry that might be interested in this. One being Gate 2 looks pretty soft, so I don't think it's really going to cut that hard into the queue. The second being distributed demand is out of scope, so there's not much there to take account of if you are connecting your standard import capacity project. And then thirdly, everybody seems to be leaving out this kind of battery storage and how the capacity has been allocated at a distribution level for it as well. There was a lot of other detail in the consultation, a lot of it into different, National Grid having an allowance to designate certain projects to fast track. That seems to have caused a lot of concern in some quarters. There's a real lack of detail around that. There's a bit of a lack of detail around how the distribution transmission networks will talk to each other. There's no real kind of guaranteed standards or, the issues we've seen before where distribution network operators would have sat on applications, not submitted them to the transmission, and the distribution applicants end up way down the queue behind new big transmission projects. That unfairness doesn't seem to be given much attention either. And then there's a lot of just general kind of more nerdy stuff around connection codes and different documents and how the regulation ties together. But yeah, so that's a quick kind of whistle-stop summary of the kind of consultation content and the kind of big issues as I see it that might be of interest out there more broadly. So the other topic worth talking about is, what's happened since the consultation or what else has been going on. So there's probably two things that I've seen worth reporting here. National Grid ESO have literally just announced Ofgem approval on a new transitional process for any new transmission applicants as of the 2nd of September. So if the application is clock started on the 2nd of September, they will move into a new transitional offer arrangement. So effectively what National Grid are doing here is implementing Gate 1 process almost before the wider connection reform. So if you apply at transmission, clock start from the 2nd of September, you're going to get a Gate 1 offer equivalent, which is basically a budget offer that doesn't really mean too much. So it's kind of putting new applications kind of on hold until they sort the wider connection reform and get the process into place. And for those people that do clock start after 2nd of September, they'll basically have to wait until connection reform kicks in to then go for a Gate 2 offer when that has all been finalised. The other big one then is on the Ofgem sort of DESNES being the acronym for the relevant government department. They have a connection delivery board with the ENA, which kind of oversees a lot of this process and strategy around it. They've asked National Grid to consider going further on their Gate 2 criteria to further cut into the queue. So I think they've probably been hearing a lot of the murmurings around the wider industry and the concern on this, that it really isn't going to kind of cut in and prioritise shovel-ready projects. If you remember, the big political slogan for all of this was to move away from first come, first serve to first ready, first connect, which the current proposal doesn't really do too much on. So they have asked National Grid ESO to go further. They've basically asked them to consider two kind of avenues and come back with a short list of options in September to look at it in more detail. So one is around technical criteria and introducing additional technical criteria into, effectively Gate 2. And this could be grid-related technical criteria. So it could relate to what sort of projects or what size of projects could connect at different voltage levels, or it could be related to the local grid in that area. Or it could also be technology type criteria, so i.e. setting maybe annual quotas for solar, wind, battery storage. And then the other kind of big area is financial criteria, so effectively asking them to look at raising the bar financially before projects can book up capacity. So there's not a lot of detail in this at this stage. Basically, Ofgem and DESNES have tasked NGESO to go away, look at this in a bit of detail, come up with a short list of options, and report back to the Connections Delivery Board in September. So that'll be a really key topic to look at. And it is actually good to see the concern around the industry that this isn't cutting hard enough being recognised and acted on so quickly. So I think, to be fair, Ofgem and DESNES deserve a bit of credit on that. So as I say, that's a quick wrap up of the connection reform consultation. Obviously, I think there was about 20 different topics consulted on in there. So there is a lot more detail, but as I say, I think those are the three key high level topics covered at this stage. We'll obviously be keeping a tight eye on what goes on around the connection delivery board, and it also it looks as if they're already looking to make progress and strengthen the reform already, which is positive too. So we'll be keeping an eye on things, and we'll be back with another podcast in this series. I'm sure probably late September, maybe early October time, and look to try and keep everybody up to date as much as possible. If you do want to like the podcast, you can subscribe on Spotify, YouTube, or just generally wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks. We'll be back again in September.